September means 7, yet it is the 9th month. October means 8, yet it is the 10th. November means 9. December means 10. You have spoken these words your entire life without stopping to hear the contradiction inside them. The error is right there in plain sight, repeated every year, printed on every screen, stitched into every planner, whispered by every teacher, and still almost nobody asks the obvious question. If the names are wrong, then what system were they named for? And if that older system was replaced, what exactly got removed when the world was taught to forget it? If you enjoy hidden history stories that make ordinary things feel unsettling, subscribe now and stay with me, because this is not just a story about month names. It is a story about how time was reorganized, who gained the power to organize it, and why the calendar you trust may be less natural than it looks. Because those names are not random mistakes. They are survivors, fossils from a calendar that no longer officially exists. In the old Roman system, the year began in March. That made September the 7th month, October the 8th, November the 9th, and December the 10th. Then something changed. 2 months were inserted at the front. The whole structure shifted forward, but the names stayed behind, like scars left on the language after the surgery was over. We are still living inside that edit more than 2,500 years later, and most people never notice that their own calendar is quietly confessing it has been rewritten. And that is not even the strangest part. The strangest part is what may have existed before that edit. What kind of timekeeping humans used before imperial systems hardened into law? What relationship to the sky, to the body, to recurring cycles may have been older than the neat 12-month order we now treat as obvious? Because once you step back from the calendar you were given, one uncomfortable fact comes into view. A solar year does not contain 12 full moons. It contains about 13 lunar cycles. Not 12. 13. The moon does not care about your paperwork. It does not care about Roman reforms, papal decrees, software settings, tax years, or financial quarters. It keeps moving in its own rhythm, from new moon to new moon in roughly 29.5 days. Multiply that by 12 and you get about 354 days, well short of the solar year. But 13 lunar cycles bring you strikingly close to a full annual rhythm, close enough that ancient societies across the world had to reckon with that fact in one way or another. Some inserted extra days, some inserted entire months, some built festivals around the gap. Some treated the mismatch not as a flaw, but as something sacred, a threshold, a moment outside ordinary time. That idea feels alien to the modern mind because we have been trained to think of calendars as fixed systems handed down by authority. But for most of human history, time was not a printed grid. It was recurrence, darkness and dawn, rain and drought, bleeding and healing, seed time and harvest, the moon swelling, thinning, disappearing, and returning again. Before civilization turned time into administration, time was something the body could feel and the sky could teach. That possibility becomes more haunting when you look at one of the oldest artifacts ever linked to counting. On the edge of Lake Edward, in the region between present-day Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, an object was discovered in the 20th century that would later become famous as the Ishango bone. Small enough to fit in a hand, made from a baboon fibula, carved with grouped notches, ancient almost beyond imagination. Dated to around 20,000 years old, it has been called one of the earliest mathematical artifacts known. Scholars have debated it for decades. Some saw numerical groupings. Some saw prime numbers. Some saw a counting tool. Alexander Marshak argued that the marks reflected lunar notation. Others pushed that idea further and suggested the markings may have been tied to menstruation, fertility, or the human attempt to align bodily cycles with the moon. That interpretation is debated, and it should remain debated. But even that debate reveals something important. The very first human acts of counting may not have begun in a king's treasury or a priest's archive. They may have begun with attention, with watching, with waiting, with someone noticing that the moon and the body moved in related rhythms and that those rhythms returned often enough to be trusted. Not because an institution said so, because life itself said so. In many languages, month and moon remain close cousins. The linguistic echo survives even after the original intimacy is gone. We still carry the memory in words long after we stopped recognizing what the words remembered. That, more than anything, is what makes the calendar story feel less like a neutral evolution and more like a layered replacement. A natural rhythm once observed directly, then a civic system, then a political instrument, then an unquestioned habit. Rome sits at the center of that transformation. According to Roman tradition, the earliest Roman calendar, attributed to Romulus, contained only 10 months. It began in March and ended in December. Winter was left in a strange limbo, a stretch of time not fully counted by the official civic structure. Imagine that kind of world. A calendar that simply stopped before the coldest part of the year, leaving a block of unstructured time hanging outside formal order. Then, according to tradition, Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius, reworked the system. January and February were added. The year expanded. The numerical logic of the later months was broken, but the names remained. September still meant 7. October still meant 8. And from that moment onward, language and structure no longer matched. But Numa's reform was not just a tidy administrative improvement. It opened the door to something far more consequential. Once a calendar becomes official, whoever controls it controls more than dates. They control terms of office, tax cycles, legal deadlines, rituals, markets, military service, debt obligations, and the entire psychological shape of normal life. In Republican Rome, the timing of intercalary adjustments could be manipulated by elites. Priests and politicians learned quickly that if you control the calendar, you can quietly control power itself. A magistrate's term could be stretched. An enemy's influence could be shortened. Public life could be nudged, delayed, accelerated, or distorted, simply by tampering with the structure of time. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman calendar had become so mismanaged that it drifted badly out of alignment with the seasons. Festivals appeared at the wrong agricultural moments. Civil order no longer matched the natural year it claimed to organize. Julius Caesar stepped in with a major reform, forcing the system back into line through a drastic correction. The year 46 BCE became absurdly long because extra days had to be inserted to repair the accumulated confusion. That year was remembered as the year of confusion, which is appropriate, because confusion is what remains whenever time has been bent for political convenience and then forcibly reset. Caesar's solution became the Julian calendar, and for centuries it spread with Roman influence. On paper, it looked rational. It was more stable, more centralized, more authoritative. But it also completed the transformation of time from something primarily observed into something increasingly imposed. The sky was still there, the moon was still moving, the seasons were still turning, but official reality now depended on an imperial framework. The world inherited it because empire had the power to make inheritance feel inevitable, and yet even that was not the final version. By the 16th century, the Julian calendar itself had drifted measurably against the solar year. The seasons were beginning to slide against the ecclesiastical calculations that mattered to the church, especially the determination of Easter. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced another reform. The leap year rules were adjusted. The drift was corrected. Astronomically, it was a smarter system. That much is true. But the way the correction entered lived reality remains astonishing. In the first countries to adopt it, people went to bed on October 4 and woke up on October 15. 10 calendar dates were erased in a single move. That is the kind of sentence people hear too casually. 10 days were erased, not faded out, not slowly phased away over decades, removed by decree. Contracts, wages, deadlines, obligations, all had to be forced through the new reality. Later, when Britain and its empire finally made the same change in 1752, 11 dates vanished there too. September 2 was followed by September 14. Whether every famous street protest was exactly as later retellings claim matters less than the deeper reaction. Ordinary people understood that when authorities can remove days from your life with a signature, time is not just a neutral measurement. It is an instrument of power, and that is the point where the modern mind usually stops. We tell ourselves the matter is settled. Yes, the Gregorian calendar is the most accurate, broadly used civil calendar for the solar year. Yes, solar accuracy matters. Yes, agriculture, navigation, administration, and global coordination all benefit from regular seasonal alignment. All of that is true. But that answer also smuggles in a hidden assumption that the purpose of a calendar is primarily to serve institutions at scale. States, churches, empires, markets. The question almost never asked is whether something was lost when that priority became absolute. Because the moon did not stop cycling. Human biology did not stop cycling. The body did not reorganize itself around papal reform. The sky did not vote for 12. And that is why the story becomes stranger again in the 20th century, when the idea of 13 months returned not from mystics, but from accountants. In 1902, a British railway accountant named Moses Cotsworth proposed an alternative calendar that sounds radical only because your mind has been trained by irregularity. His system divided the year into 13 equal months of 28 days each. Every month contained exactly 4 weeks. Every date landed on the same weekday every year. Every quarter became perfectly comparable. Every accounting period became equal in length. A single extra day at the end of the year would sit outside the weekly cycle, and in leap years one more day would be added. The additional month, placed between June and July, was given the name Sol. Look closely at that design and you begin to feel something close to embarrassment about the system you already use. The modern month is not actually a fixed unit. It can be 28 days, 29, 30, or 31. It can hold different numbers of weekends. It can distort payroll, rent, reporting, and productivity comparisons simply because its size changes. We would never accept that kind of inconsistency in any other unit of measurement. Imagine the ruler that quietly altered its own inches depending on the season. Imagine a kilogram that changed weight from month to month. We would consider it absurd. Yet we allow the month to function that way and then pretend the problem is philosophical rather than practical. Cotsworth did not think it was philosophical. He thought it was inefficient, confusing, and unnecessary. He wanted a calendar in which the units actually meant something stable. And he found allies. George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, became one of the most important advocates of the international fixed calendar. In 1928, Kodak adopted the 13-month system internally. Not as a publicity stunt, not as a fringe experiment, but as a functioning business structure. For decades, the company operated on it. Financial comparisons became cleaner. Reporting periods became equal. Internal order improved. Kodak used the system until 1989. More than half a century of proof that a 13-month year was not a fantasy. It worked. That alone should be enough to provoke a larger cultural memory. But most people have never heard of it. They have never heard that serious calendar reform was once on the table internationally. They have never heard that the League of Nations reviewed reform proposals and that versions of a fixed calendar attracted significant support. They have never heard that the resistance was not based only on practicality, but also on sacred continuity. Religious leaders objected that a blank day outside the 7-day week would disrupt perpetual worship cycles, especially the Sabbath rhythm. That objection carried enormous weight, and the reform stalled. Then the political storms of the 20th century grew darker. Fascism rose. War consumed Europe. The League of Nations collapsed, and with it, the last truly serious international push to rebuild the calendar. So pause there for a second. A major corporation proved a 13-month structure could function. International bodies took reform seriously. The basic arithmetic was elegant. The practical benefits were obvious. Yet the world did not change. Not because the idea lacked order, but because calendars are not merely systems of order. They are systems of allegiance. Once a civilization binds worship, labor, schooling, law, finance, and memory to a particular structure of time, altering that structure becomes almost impossible. People do not just fear confusion, they fear losing the reality the calendar makes feel normal. And perhaps that helps explain the curious shadow hanging over the number 13 itself. Why is 13 feared? Why is it skipped in buildings, avoided in rows, hidden in addresses, treated as somehow tainted? The usual explanations are shakier than people assume. Much of the superstition appears relatively lame. Some of the famous ancient stories invoked as proof either do not say what modern retellings claim or are later embellishments layered backward onto older material. Fear of 13 begins to look less like timeless folklore and more like a cultural habit that grew powerful because nobody needed to defend it once it became normal. 12, meanwhile, feels complete. 12 months, 12 zodiac signs, 12 hours on the clock face, 12 apostles, 12 tribes. It closes cleanly. It is neat, divisible, stable in the imagination. 13 interrupts that perfection. It feels like overflow. It feels like remainder. It feels like a pattern broken. But what if the reverse is closer to the truth? What if 13 feels unsettling not because it is inherently wrong, but because it hints that the neatness of 12 was achieved by suppressing something older and messier and more alive? That possibility becomes harder to dismiss when you remember that 13-month calendars did not vanish everywhere. Ethiopia still uses one. 12 months of 30 days, followed by a 13th month of 5 days, or 6 in a leap year. It is not an obscure curiosity. It is a living civil reality for more than 100 million people. Its structure descends through ancient traditions linked to the Coptic and older Egyptian systems. Its tourism slogan even leans into it. 13 months of sunshine. To someone formed entirely by the Gregorian system, this can sound exotic, almost unreal. But that reaction reveals more about us than about Ethiopia. Their calendar works. It has worked for centuries. It is simple in ways ours is not. Uniform months, clear structure, predictable rhythm. When travelers arrive in Addis Ababa and find that the local year numbering differs from what their phones expected, the sensation can be eerie, as if they have stepped into an alternate timeline. But perhaps the deeper truth is the reverse. They have not stepped outside history. They have stepped into the presence of a different historical choice, one not fully overwritten by the same imperial timeline that trained the rest of the world to think 12 was inevitable. And then there is the children's rhyme. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. You were taught a poem to remember your own calendar because your own calendar does not explain itself. It has to be memorized. It has to be patched into the mind through rhythm because it resists intuition. 13 months of 28 days needs almost no mnemonic. A child can understand it at once. The current system demands recitation because it is an inherited compromise, not a transparent design. And compromises have a way of disguising themselves as nature once enough generations are raised inside them. That may be the most unsettling realization in all of this. The power of the calendar does not lie only in how it organizes dates. It lies in how completely it teaches you what not to question. Once a structure becomes ordinary, it disappears from view. You stop asking why some months have 30 days and others 31. You stop asking why February is different. You stop asking why the names of the final 4 months are misnumbered. You stop asking whether a month is even a real unit if its size keeps changing. You stop asking because normality is the most efficient censorship mechanism ever invented. And maybe that is why the image of those Roman pontifices remains so powerful. Priests controlling intercalation, deciding when extra time would be inserted, quietly influencing political life through the management of the calendar. That sounds ancient, distant, almost theatrical. Yet the principle is recognizable. Whoever controls the official measurement of time controls more than scheduling. They control expectation. They control legitimacy. They control the invisible frame inside which an entire society experiences reality. This is not an argument that the Gregorian calendar is useless. It is not. It is an extraordinarily effective civil tool. Nor is it an argument that ancient people possessed a perfect universal 13-month system which modernity foolishly abandoned. History is more complicated than that. Evidence is fragmentary. Interpretations differ. Solar calendars solved real problems. Agriculture does care about the sun. States do need coordination. But complexity does not erase the more disturbing possibility that the calendar you inherited is not simply the best design, but the design that won. One through empire, one through religion, one through administrative power, one through habit, one so completely that now, when people hear 13 months, they do not think possibility, they think superstition, and still the clues remain everywhere. In the names of the months, in the missing days of 1,582 and 1,752, in the Ishango bone sitting in a museum, its notches still provoking arguments across 20 millennia. In Kodak's decades of quiet proof, in Ethiopia's living example, in the moon itself, circling overhead, Indifferent to whether you believe it matters, the sky still counts in cycles. The body still counts in cycles. Ancient memory still echoes through language. The only thing that changed completely was the authority structure wrapped around them. So perhaps the real question is not whether 13 is better than 12 in some abstract mathematical sense. The real question is what kind of world each system serves. A world of seasons and states, a world of rituals and markets, a world of human bodies, a world of imperial administration, a world of visible recurrence, a world of invisible control, because the way a civilization measures time reveals what that civilization values most. If time is arranged for institutions, then institutions become reality. If time is arranged for trade, then the calendar becomes economic machinery. If time is arranged around the heavens, then the sky remains the teacher. And if time is arranged around the body, then history begins not with decrees, but with attention. That is why this story lingers long after the facts are done. September still means 7. October still means 8. The language has never fully agreed to the edit. The moon has never fully agreed to it either. The body certainly has not. We are the ones who agreed. Mostly by inheritance. Mostly without noticing. Mostly because the system was already there before we were old enough to question it. You learned the names before you learned the contradiction. You memorized the rhyme before you understood why a rhyme was necessary. You inherited the month before anyone asked whether the month made sense. And by the time you were old enough to notice, the structure was already deep enough in your mind to feel like nature. But it is not nature. It is history. And history means it was made. Made by choices. Made by reforms. Made by priests, rulers, clerics, accountants, and institutions. Made, revised, corrected, imposed, defended, normalized. A human architecture built so thoroughly around you that you almost never feel its walls, until one day you hear September and realize it still means 7. And then the whole thing opens. Because if something as basic as the calendar carries visible evidence of revision, what else in ordinary life has been edited so completely that we mistake inheritance for truth? What else do we repeat every day without hearing the older world trapped inside it? What else did power not destroy, but simply rename? That is what keeps pulling me back to the image of the moon over the oldest landscapes. No empire yet. No senate. No papal seal. No quarterly report. Just recurrence. Just the patient return of light and darkness, swelling and loss, disappearance and reappearance. A system you do not need to memorize because it presents itself. A system older than Rome, older than Christianity, older than states, older than writing, older perhaps than any story we now tell about the beginning of order. The moon kept count before institutions taught us how to ignore it. And maybe that is the deepest tension in this entire story. Not that humanity lost a perfect calendar, but that we traded a visible relationship for an administered one. We traded participation for compliance. We traded watching for obeying. We traded rhythms that could be felt for units that had to be memorized. And because the replacement was useful, efficient, and eventually global, we stopped asking what had been sacrificed to make it feel inevitable. The calendar on your wall looks neutral. That may be its greatest trick. Because once you start noticing the seams, you realize it is not just measuring time. It is teaching you what time is supposed to be. And the most powerful systems are always the ones that make their own design look natural. So the next time you hear September, hear the 7 still buried inside it. The next time someone jokes about 13 as unlucky, ask yourself who taught the joke to survive. The next time you recite the rhyme about 30 days, ask why your own calendar needs a poem to remain usable. And the next time the moon returns full above you for the 13th time in a year, remember that the sky is still keeping a count older than empire. The names remember. The moon remembers. The old notches in bone may remember. Ethiopia remembers. History remembers. The only question is why the rest of us were taught not to.